It's 26th of May, and this lunar eclipse that was happening, they said it's happening May 26th. And so I thought, oh, great, we'll have a lunar eclipse right as we're going into the 2 a.m., 3 a.m. morning puja, and then it hit me this morning, oh wait, that's May 27th. So it's already passed. So, this is called a super flower blood moon. And they called it a super moon, of course, because it's at its perigee, it's the closest to the earth. And then the blood moon is because it turns red when it gets eclipsed, but then I didn't know why it was called flower. So probably just the time of year, springtime, flowers coming out. But the fact that it's also on Vesakha Puja is unusual. So this day, what we call Vesakha Puja, or Buddha's birthday, then it's also they say, according to the legends, according to our stories, that the Buddha was born on the full moon of May, was enlightened on the full moon of May, and also passed away on the full moon of May. So we celebrate those 3 times on this day. And of course we say the Buddha was born, but actually at the time of the birth, that particular being who became the Buddha was classed as the Bodhisattva, or the Buddha to be. So until the enlightenment under the Bodhi Tree, we refer to that being as the Bodhisattva, not as the Buddha yet. So the Bodhisattva was born in Lumbini, which is one of the 4 major Buddhist holy sites, and the Bodhisattva was enlightened and thus became the Buddha, the awakened one, under the Bodhi Tree at Bodh Gaya, another one of the 4 holy sites. And then after a 45-year teaching ministry, and passed away into what we call the parinibbana, the great stilling, the great cooling at Kusinara, which is another one of the 4 major holy sites. So 3 of the 4 major Buddhist holy sites are linked with this day. And then the other of the 4 holy sites being the Deer Park at Isipatana, which is where the first teaching, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, was given. And so that's the next day that we celebrate, which is at the beginning of the Vasa period, the Asalha Puja. So there's a lot that could be said. This is a Buddha Nusati, or recollection of the Buddha, can be done on this day. And for myself, what I do, because I have a visual mind, is almost like create a movie of the Buddha and recollecting different parts of the Buddha's life. If I want to do Buddha Nusati, different parts of the Buddha's life, which I find inspiring. In particular, the Buddha leaving home at the age of, well, we say 29, but the way it's worded in the suttas was in his 29th year, which would mean he was 28. So we don't know if he was 28 or 29, somewhere around there, that he left the home life, that the Bodhisattva left the home life to seek Buddhahood, to seek the deathless. And for me, that's a pivotal event. Also, a recollection of these 3 times, the birth of the Bodhisattva, the enlightenment, and thus becoming the Buddha, the parinibbana. These all occurred in the forest. They all occurred outside. Bodhisattva was born outside, the Buddha was enlightened outside, the Buddha passed away outside. So the Buddha had this love for nature, loved being outside, loved to sit and meditate at the foot of a tree. It's not that he never lived in a monk's hut, or kuti as we call it. So it's not that he never lived in a kuti. He did for a lot of the time, but then also he wandered from place to place and gave teachings and sat with the monks outside. So any recollection of the Buddha is also a recollection of being outside, of being in nature. And we're kind of doing that now by keeping the doors open and just letting the wind blow in our face. We say we have to... This isn't a bad thing. It's just nature. It's just wind. So I like to think perhaps even when the Buddha was older, maybe that birth in a forest gave him that perception of enjoyment in the forest. Even right after leaving home, when the Buddha in one of his teachings talking about when he left home, when he left the palace, because he was a prince living in utter luxury before leaving home. So he talks about that, going into the forest in his first experience of living and meditating completely alone in the forest, and they gave him great peace, gave him great solace. And even though he hadn't attained awakening yet, he found great peace and solitude in the forest. Of course, when I think of this day, this Vesakha Puja, what I really think of is the sitting under the Bodhi Tree and practicing, and so that the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, sitting under the Bodhi Tree. And you can go to this holy site now, and there'll be thousands, well, not this last year, but before 2020, there'd be thousands of people there. There'd be people circling the Mahabodhi Stupa. There's the fourth generation of the Bodhi tree is there. The Bodhi trees live at the longest 800 to 1200 years, so this is the fourth Bodhi tree, they say. It's still more or less on the same spot. And thousands of people, loudspeakers, monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen of every Buddhist tradition. You get Buddhist spiritual heavyweights showing up there, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you get the Karmapa, and you get great Thai Ajahns showing up there, paying respects. So really the epicenter of Buddhism in the world. And so really that's where it all began. So for when I think about Vesakha Puja, I think about the Bodhi tree. And according to the story, the Bodhisattva attaining awakening and becoming the Buddha on the full moon of May. So that before that means he was practicing as the moon was coming into full. And in the 6 years since leaving the home life, he practiced very, very hard without letting up in the meditation practice. Not really sure if he would actually attain his goal. So without a guide, without a teacher, having practiced with some of the top meditation masters of the day, but then actually gaining their attainments and deciding that wasn't yet the deathless, and then actually surpassing them and having to go off on his own and practice the most fearsome and horrible, painful austerities, seeking perhaps liberation comes about through torturing the body and undergoing painful penance, and then eventually finding even that didn't lead to the deathless, didn't lead to the permanent end of suffering or liberation, as we call it, vimutti in the Pali. And then having this realization of the middle way of practice where it was neither self-indulgence or self-torment, but that through a very fine balance and composure of the mind and body that we call the jhanas, then through that, then finding that was the path to awakening. So actually in that very end period, just before Buddhahood was attained, then he had a memory of being a child during a harvest festival that his father, the king, was at, and he was maybe about 10 years old at the time, So having this memory of this harvest festival, and harvest festivals, we know them, big parties, and so there's a lot of noise, a lot of people, and they're doing some sort of plowing ceremony, and suddenly the child, the prince, the bodhisatta, an intense feeling of solitude coming over him and wanting to get away from the crowd. So that sense of wanting to get away from the crowd, and went and sat under a rose apple tree off and in more of a quiet area, and the mind just becoming very quiet. And at that point, the young child, the prince, his mind becoming very composed and entering into the first jhana, where there's still thinking and pondering, but there's also joy, rapture, happiness, and one-pointedness of mind, and absorbing into that state of meditation, of deep meditation. And so the bodhisatta, after doing these horrific austerities, he had that memory and thought, maybe that's the path, maybe that mental composure, because it's a type of mental happiness which is totally and utterly blameless and not dependent on sensuality. So remembering that, maybe I could cultivate that. But that it wasn't possible with a severely emaciated and tortured body, so having to actually get back to some sort of health. And then from that point on, the practice really took off, and the mind started to deepen, and the insight knowledges started to awaken in him. So then we come to under the Bodhi Tree, and that final night of practice. And so most Buddhists will know that story of the final night of practice, the attainment of the triple knowledge. And this triple knowledge, it's fun to go into it a little bit further and contemplate it and think about it, talk about it, discuss it, because it is very interesting, these different insights that the Bodhisatta had, which culminated in full awakening, Buddhahood. So that the first watch of the night, so he sat through the whole night, and the first watch of the night, which is, each watch of the night is roughly 4 hours, 3 or 4 hours, and first watch of the night, we could say roughly 6 p.m. to 10 p.m., and the knowledge of, he saw his past lives back, 1 birth, 2 birth, 3 births, 10 births, 20 births, 100 births, 1,000 births, 10,000 births, 100,000 births, many aeons of world expansion births, many aeons of world contraction births. And in each birth, the knowledge, I was such and such a person, had such and such a name, or I was such and such a class of being. He wasn't always reborn as people, but had such and such was my lifespan. Having passed away from there, I re-arose here. And it went on and on and on and on. And that no beginning was discernible, so that's the insight knowledge into the beginningless nature of samsara. But also it's the insight knowledge into the lack of essence nature of samsara, of cyclic existence. And there is no suffering that he hadn't undergone. There was no happiness that he hadn't experienced in the long round of rebirths. And even through experiencing the most unbelievable happiness as God beings, as Brahma gods, and as Deva kings, and having experienced the most unbelievable suffering in the hells and the ghost realms, even then, none of those experiences had any lasting benefit. None of those experiences had any essence to them. They were all impermanent. They all arose and passed away. So even with all that experience, having experienced the heights of happiness, having experienced the depths of suffering, none of it had any essence, had any meaning. So there's not only the beginningless nature of samsara, but the lack of essence nature of samsara. So that's the insight knowledge that arose in the first night, according to the suttas, according to the stories. The second watch of the night, so we could say roughly 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., the knowledge of that all beings are in the same boat, and this is true for all beings, not just for himself. And this was the insight into the law of kamma, so we're more familiar with karma. The word karma in Pali, it's kamma. And this was the insight knowledge that all beings are in the same boat. They're arising and passing away based on their good and bad actions, is dictating where they arise and where they re-arise upon death, in whatever class of being they may be. So that seeing that beings that did good actions of body, speech, and mind went up to higher realms and more blissful realms of existence, and that beings that undertook bad and unskillful and actions of body, speech, and mind went down to realms of torment and suffering and unhappiness. And that this was happening to every being of every type. And so this is the second insight knowledge, is the knowledge of kamma, of the efficacy of moral action. Then in the third watch of the night is then, we could say roughly 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., is the knowledge of the ending of the outflows, or the ending of the defilements of the mind, which leads to complete ending of the round of this existence. And so this is the third insight knowledge, is the realization of the Four Noble Truths and dependent origination. And this is what actually causes the mind to attain that irreversible state that we think of as liberation, or nibbana, or whatever we want to think of it, the end of suffering, the highest happiness. And so it's a state that's transcendent. And when the Buddha talks about what he attained in this last watch of the night, so in other places in the teachings, he talks about worldly attainments and spiritual attainments, and worldly attainments would be like attainments of things like fame and gain and pleasure, honor, and spiritual attainments being things like doing acts of generosity and thereby attaining great happiness upon the time of death, great happiness as, say, a celestial being or a deva, or spiritual attainments being things like attaining the jhanas, attaining the meditative absorptions and blissful attainments. But then he talks about the more spiritual than the spiritual, and that's nibbana. So he talks about nibbana as being more spiritual than the spiritual, which is a transcendent state that's not dependent. It's the unconditioned state, or the state that's not dependent on other states. So we won't get into the nature of that too much here, but just that this is a contemplation, this is something we can think about, that insight knowledge, that was the third of the triple, what we call the triple knowledge, that was attained on that night in Bodh Gaya, the Bodhi Tree. And when the Bodhisattva was practicing there, then he was by himself. It was just a forest with this tree in it, and he was just by himself. And the Bodhi tree, it really, it's just a tree. It's a type of fig tree. It has these little figs on it, and it really only has significance because the Bodhisattva sat under it and became the Buddha. But also, we come back to this contemplation of nature. And what the Buddha realized, he also if we really distill it down, he referred to it as like just a natural law, a realization into natural laws or into nature as it is. So he's sitting at the Bodhi tree, and look at these details of how he's sitting, and we can create, if we have visual minds, we can actually visualize this sitting facing east under this tree. And the Bodhi trees, they're quite interesting in that, from what I've heard or learned about trees, that most trees, as we know, we exhale carbon dioxide, trees exhale oxygen, and they inhale carbon dioxide and exhale oxygen, whereas we inhale oxygen, exhale carbon dioxide. So most trees, they quote-unquote exhale their oxygen at certain times of the day, either during the day or during the night. But they also have rest times where the trees will actually not exhale so much oxygen from them. But Bodhi trees are unique in that they exhale day and night. So they actually exude more oxygen than a normal tree. And this is kind of fascinating in terms of the Buddha choosing that type of tree to sit under. Also, just the subtleties of living outside and how to live according to there's subtle protocols and subtle knowledges about living outside. So the Buddha choosing to sit at the foot of this tree and face east. And also when the Bodhisattva left the home life, he actually left out of the east gate toward the rising sun. And so sitting at this tree facing east, if you think of the practicalities of living and meditating outside and living at the foot of a tree, when you sit during the night, then it becomes cold. So then when the sun rises, it hits you because you're facing east with the tree at your back, and so the sun hits you in the morning time and it warms you. And then as the sun goes, and continuing to sit at the foot of that tree through the day, and the sun goes up to noontime and it's getting hotter, and then you keep sitting there, and then as it gets hotter during the day, then the sun goes into the west, and it goes behind that tree, and then you're in the shade, and then you're being cooled for the rest of the day. So it's incredibly practical to be sitting facing east at the foot of a tree with the tree at your back. And also the type of tree has significance. In this case, the Bodhi tree having a very refreshing quality to it, with exuding more oxygen, and also choosing a tree that doesn't drop a lot of sap. Sometimes people who are interested in sitting at the foots of trees, you might decide it might be nice to sit at the foot of a Doug fir tree, and you get covered in sap, or you sit in sap, and although it does smell nice, it's pretty hard to get off. And so knowing the different qualities of different trees, what's a good tree to sit under. You might want to sit under a madrone tree. The madrone trees also exude sap, but it's good to know that they only exude sap from the very tips of their branches. The sap actually comes out of the very tips of the branches. It doesn't exude out of the bark like it does on a Doug fir tree. So if you're sitting right at the base of a madrone tree, you're usually okay. You don't want to sit out at the edge of it. You might get some sap on you. So the third watch of the night is the Four Noble Truths and dependent origination, and the shattering through craving and ignorance, and the full relinquishment of craving and ignorance, and therefore the awakening. Now after the awakening under the Bodhi tree, then the Buddha stayed in the vicinity for 49 days. That's how the story goes. And for each 7-day block in different locations, either under or around the Bodhi tree, absorbed into and in a state of wonder at the bliss of deliverance, what it actually is, the profound nature of of the awakened mind. Then he decides to teach, and teaches for 45 years. And then finally, at the end of his life, the Mahaparinibana Sutta, it goes through the last days of the Buddha, especially the last few months. And there's a lot of different stories that occur in there. One that's of note is the Buddha's attendant, Ananda, asking who's going to be the teacher, who's going to be the leader when he's gone. And the Buddha says, no, there's no person. He won't appoint any person or any monk to be the leader, but that the Dhamma Vinaya itself is the leader when he's gone, and the training that he's laid forth. So the Vinaya being the trainings in body and speech, and the Dhamma being the training of the mind. So these three trainings, the training of body, speech, and mind, these are the leader when he's gone, although there will still be, even at that time and to the present day, then there's been great practitioners who have held the torch of the practice and over the centuries, over the millennia, and acted as good friends and guides. But ultimately, we're always pointing back to the Buddha and the Dhamma Vinaya as the teacher. Remember the last time seeing Luangpur Ban in Thailand, and went with a group of 9 Wat Nanachat monks to see him. And one of the monks asked, "How do you teach your disciples?" And so this is Luangpur Ban. He's known for being very, very strong and exacting teacher and very demanding. He said, "How do you teach your disciples?" And he said, "I don't have any disciples." I said, What do you mean? He said, I'm a disciple. We're all disciples of the Buddha. So that's a really good way to think about it. So the Mahaparinibana, the end of the Buddha's life, he laid down under 2 sal trees, and that final night where he's asking the monks, do they have any doubts, have any final questions? There's the last monk who was ordained in person by the Buddha, Venerable Subhadda, and that takes place that night. He's a wanderer who comes in and has faith and wants to ordain with the Buddha. And then the Buddha actually passing away that evening on the full moon of May again. So these 3 occasions, they're good to think about. The Buddha was born in the forest, was awakened, was enlightened in the forest, passed away in the forest. So it's both a recollection of those 3 times and a recollection of just the qualities of nature and how we can contemplate nature and get in touch with nature, commune with nature as a practice. It's very important. So as a recollection of Vesakha Puja, then I'll leave that there for the talk this evening.